Walls and houses fallen and rebuilt so many times over the years that the city now rests on a mound 100 feet deep in debris. Here, at the end of the second millennium AD, is the very image of the first urban life on Earth. Massive burned brick walls towering over the plain. If you could have flown over the densely packed workers' quarters of Uruk, Nippur, or Ur of the Chaldees, this is what you would have seen. And within the walls of Erbil, we can still get an idea of how people lived and how society was organized in those first cities of old Sumer. For here the past literally is still alive. Inside the old citadel at Erbil, you find yourself in a maze of narrow lanes and alleyways fanning out from the main gate. And although the mud brick houses on either side have been rebuilt and destroyed countless times over the generations, the pattern of the streets is still essentially the same. There are 800 families here today, that's 4,000 people, organized into neighborhood wards just as they were in Ur and Nippur. So these were small-scale, face-to-face communities which knew each other or were related by kinship or marriage or from the old village, perhaps with a local shrine and a tiny little market, rather like later Islamic cities where each ward had its mosque, its souk, and its bath. In ancient times, the soul of the Mesopotamian town was the temple, towering over the mud brick streets, a visible assurance to the townspeople that God was among them. It's still like that today. The Al-Mullah family has run the mosque here in Erbil for 600 years. In just the same fashion in ancient cities like Uruk or Nippur, single families can be traced over many generations running the main temples. In this little corner of Iraq, the gods have come and gone. Ishtar, Zoroaster, Yahweh, Jesus, and now Allah. But the ritual of worship itself has remained. And on this spot where the oracle of the goddess Ishtar once stood, there's been continuous worship for longer than anywhere else in the world. In such continuity, perhaps, lies one of the defining qualities of civilization. Civilization was a great achievement, and the Sumerians were justly proud of it. They loved city life and the luxuries it afforded. But at heart they were a pessimistic people who knew how fragile human achievement could be. On the famous standard from the golden age of the city of Ur, images of war and peace are mysteriously juxtaposed. One of the great Sumerian myths tells how the goddess Inanna brought the arts of civilization from the god of wisdom, Enki of Eridu, like Pandora's box. Here were the delights of society, exquisite craftsmanship, beautiful clothes, the arts of sex and music. But civilization has a darker side, said Enki, which has to be accepted along with the good. There was the art of being mighty, the art of being kind, the art of straightforwardness, the art of deceit, the art of kingship, justice, and the enduring crown. The resounding note of a musical instrument, rejoicing of the heart, the kindling of strife, the plundering of cities, the setting up of lamentation, fear, pity, terror. All this is civilization, said the god of wisdom. All this I give you, and you must take it all with no argument, and once taken, you cannot give it back. In around 2000 BC, signs of foreboding swept Sumer. Too much agricultural land had been ruined, inflation set in, famine, economic collapse. Evil, wrote the king Ibisin, is descending on our land. Then, all the cities of Sumer were smashed by a coalition of ancient enemies from Iran and the desert. Is destroyed. Bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot bronze in a mold. Bodies dissolve like fat in the sun. Our temple is destroyed. The gods have abandoned us like migrating birds. Smoke lies on our city like a shroud. Their lament has echoed down the ages, to be heard again at Troy, at Dresden, at Hiroshima. And how loaded with meaning it is for we of the late 20th century. For now we too have seen the columns of smoke hanging over Mesopotamia like a shroud. The people of Sumer would sing laments for their sacked cities for 2,000 years. Meanwhile, refugees fled Iraq on the caravan routes across the western desert, images evoking those of our own time. City dwellers become as one with nomads who'd never known a city. Among them, the Bible says, was a citizen of Ur, now revered by half the world, Abraham. Witnesses to the ruin of civilization, faced by the unyielding harshness of nature. Cast out of Eden, for such people perhaps the old gods had failed. For Abraham, son of an idol maker in the old city of Ur, the disaster sowed the seeds of an idea which would change the world. An idea of stark simplicity, a single God, God the Father. Abraham took his idea with him as he migrated to Palestine. And now, ironically, he's viewed as the founding father by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. For Abraham was the first man to make a covenant with God. It was perhaps Iraq's greatest legacy to the world. In the 7th century AD, Arab armies bearing the new faith of Islam swept into Mesopotamia, here at the cliff which gave the land its name, Al-Iraq. The coming of Islam to the land of Abraham was, in a sense, a homecoming, culmination of a long trend in the spiritual life of the Near East. Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks and Persians had all ruled this intractable brown land in long cycles of growth and decay. And gradually, through the triumphs and disasters, the people had come to view God with an attitude of unquestioning submission. And so the way was paved for the coming of Islam to the cliff which gave the land its name, Al-Iraq. After the Arab conquest in the south of Iraq, Old Sumer, Islam took on a distinctive local form which remained true to its ancient past, Shi'ism. In the sacred city of Cradle, the Shiites carried the ancient Sumerian tradition of lamentation close to their hearts as no other faith has done. And so it had been for thousands of years before Islam. Even the physical appearance of the great mosque of Imam Hussein at Karbala recalls the buildings of old Sumer, with its mosaics and the same blue tiles which had adorned the shrines of Uruk. A true temple, as the Sumerians would have said, shining like a rainbow in the bright sun. Shiism remains today the religion of the farmers and peasants of southern Iraq, old Sumer, ruled since the Arab conquest by Sunni Muslim masters in Baghdad. In 1991, at the end of the Gulf War, Karbala was devastated as the Shiites rose again against their overlords. Once more, the sacred shrine of Sumer was sacked and desecrated. And as so often before, the people of the south were left to lament. With such a tragic and turbulent history, it's amazing that so many different sects have managed to survive and flourish here. This is a Mandean wedding. The Mandeans are an astonishing survival of ancient Mesopotamian religious traditions. You could say they're the last of the Babylonians, but they also put us in touch with the baptismal customs out of which Christianity arose. For like Jesus, they call themselves followers of John the Baptist. Their wedding ceremonies are accompanied by full immersion in the Tigris, which in commemoration they still call the Jordan. This is perhaps as near as we can get today to the culture in which Jesus lived. The Mandeans are a reminder of how pluralism and tolerance are essential qualities of civilization. A reminder, too, of how ordinary Iraqi people, despite the catastrophes of their history, have preserved tenaciously the things they hold dear. Life is victorious, says their marriage service. And indeed, what if a man gain the whole world and lose his soul? Baghdad had been founded by the Arab conquerors of Iraq in the 8th century. It became the greatest cultural center in the world, the richest city on earth, it was said. Little survives of that time today. Successive destructions of Baghdad have seen to that. But in the center of the old city is the mosque of its patron saint, Abd al-Ghailani. This was built at a time when colleges and philanthropic institutions were created throughout Islam before the universities of the West, before Oxford, the Sorbonne, and Bologna. The civilized atmosphere of its courtyards brings to mind the great scholars of the past who learned and taught here, scholars who translated the sacred books of the Jews and Christians, as they said, that we might better understand the decisions of God. Humane learning, wrote one of them, Abd al-Latif, leaves an aura like a ray of bright light shining on those who come after. And inside the shrine, you're reminded again of the old customs of Mesopotamian worship in the glittering Holy of Holies, whose magnificence distantly reflects something of that old pre-Islamic world. Saint, poet and mystic, Al-Gaylani was founder of one of the great Sufi orders. And to pause for thought here in his shrine is to feel what a dynamic force Iraqi Islam, Shia and Sunni, has been through history. But now, at the end of the 20th century, however much the rich and complacent West may wish it otherwise, Islam is once again a great power in the world. A beacon for the dispossessed peoples of Asia and Africa, an idea for which people still live and die. From the time of Harun al-Rashid, Baghdad was one of the three greatest cities in the world, along with Constantinople and Xi'an in China. And like them, it was one of the great transmitters by which the cultural legacy of the ancients was passed on to the medieval and modern world. It's often forgotten in the West, but much of the Greek scientific and philosophical legacy was passed on to us by Arab scholars. And here in Baghdad in particular, the Mesopotamian legacy in astronomy and mathematics is found in medieval Arab texts, like this one. The library here at the Gaylani Mosque was founded in the 12th century, and some of its books date from that time, like this beautiful Quran. But it was one of the great tragedies in the history of Iraq that this period of high culture in Baghdad was cut short by the devastating Mongol attack of 1258, when the city was totally destroyed. And in the aftermath, one of the survivors left this poignant note. I recovered this book from the river Tigris, where it was thrown by the Mongols. Year of the Hijrah, 656. That's 1258 in the Western calendar. I am poor for the mercy of God. Muhammad Abdul Qadr from Mecca. A testimony to enduring faith, not only in God, but in the power of the written word to create civilization. You ask me, wrote a contemporary, about the sack of Baghdad. It was so horrible there are no words to describe it. I wish I'd died earlier and not seen how the fools destroyed these treasures of knowledge and learning. I thought I understood the world, but this Holocaust is so strange and pointless that I'm struck dumb. The revolution of time and its decisions have defeated reason and knowledge. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 and the wrecking of the irrigation canals was a turning point in the history of the Middle East. There's no doubt, said a Persian writer, that even if for 1,000 years to come no evil befell Iraq, it will not be possible completely to bring back the land to the state it was before. By the end of the 16th century, Iraq, the cradle of civilization, had sunk to the lowest level. The old cities of the south were dead, the land had returned to desert. 400 years of Ottoman rule left it plundered by a greedy military. The great events of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the discovery of the New World passed it by. Up here in the north, though, the old traditions of urban life hung on. This is Mosul. The 12th century Arab traveller Ibn Jubayr describes its lovely river frontage, with latticed windows and balconies. There could be no finer or more beautiful place than this, he said wistfully, to sit in the evening overlooking the river Tigris, talk to the people here who are cheerful, soft-spoken, kind and generous to strangers, fair in their dealings, civilized people. Out to the north of Mosul, in one of the loveliest spots in Iraq, the amazing religious life of the country has one more surprise. Our journey, which started in the Garden of Eden, has brought us finally to the domain of the Prince of Darkness, Satan himself. This is the shrine of the Yazidis. On the wall of the Yazidi temple, the place of honor goes to none other than the serpent from the Garden of Eden. Once unfairly branded as devil worshippers, the Yazidis believe that the real power in the world is Satan. It's Satan who dispenses good and evil, sickness and health, and so he needs careful and regular propitiation. Keeping a weather eye on the active presence of evil in the world, in their own way the Yazidis have come to terms with the devil's bargain of Iraqi history. After all its great achievements, Iraq reached the modern age like a society stopped in time. Right up until the 1920s, its ancient towns looked no different from those of the 3rd millennium BC, save that the ancients built bigger and better and had a higher standard of living. Oil would change all that, the second largest reserves in the world. And with independence, Iraq once again became a name on the world stage. Huge monuments were erected to its victorious wars. Here was a militarized society using cruelty as an arm of state. A state centered on a ruler cult which would have done credit to the ancient kings of Assyria. Heaping up thousands of battered helmets taken from Iranian dead in emulation of Sennacherib and Ashur-nasirpal, who set up pillars of skulls outside their gates, blinding our enemies with the terror-inspiring glamour of our rule. And in an eerie reenactment of past horrors, Saddam would represent himself as an all-conquering Assyrian king, riding roughshod over his foes. It was the old equation of Iraqi history, the idea that only a brutal ruler could hold the land together, stop it being plundered by its neighbors, a ruler who dealt in terror and savage and merciless punishment. There had been many such rulers in Iraq's past. Like the king who had himself represented on his public monuments, serenaded in a pleasure garden, while his enemy's severed head hung in a tree. The final step of this new order was to restore the most potent symbol of that ancient past, Babylon itself. Babylon the Great, as the Book of Revelation calls it, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. Even during the height of the war with Iran, this colossal project went ahead, rearing up palace walls with armies of guest workers from Egypt and Sudan, where Jewish captives had labored on the original. And in the rebuilt palace, every 50th brick was stamped in Arabic, restored in the era of Saddam. Just as in 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had advertised his own Babylonian revival for posterity. The message to the world from the late 20th century rulers of Iraq was simple. Mesopotamia, they said, had emerged once again from the darkness to become a bright light of civilization. But civilization consists not in walls of brick and stone, but in the ideals created within them, in the humane goals of life pursued by the predecessors who attempted to moderate naked power, as the Sumerians said, to cause justice to prevail in the land, that the strong may not oppress the weak. On the eve of the Gulf War of 1991, I returned to the marshes of southern Iraq. They'd been ravaged and then drained in the aftermath of the war with Iran. The water level had sunk, the waving green reed beds were now shriveled and brown. Once upon a time, said an ancient poet, Sumer, the great land of divine laws, had all that was needed for life. You, Sumer, set the ideals of civilization upon humankind, lofty ideals, robed in enduring light. Once upon a time, when there was no fear, no terror. In 1991, a new war was fought in this desert where the first civilization arose, close to the ruins of the first city, Uruk. Another war fought over the natural resources of the earth on which we all depend. Another war supposedly for civilization against barbarism. It is as if history has come not to its end, but back to its starting point.
Viewed from across the plain today, Uruk, the first city of the world, the city of Genesis, seems like a great source of energy whose power is exhausted. The wheel of history has turned full circle here, back to the conditions which held in the beginning, before the Sumerians patiently labored to turn this monochrome landscape into emerald green fields stretching as far as the eye can see, before they sailed their gaily festooned boats up the old track of the Euphrates from Nippur to rejoice in the spring festivals of the great goddess. As they saw it themselves, this was a heroic age, the age of Gilgamesh and the first city builders. And we city dwellers of the late 20th century in London and New York, Paris and Tokyo can take a vicarious pride in their achievement. But it is this desert landscape of Uruk which is the spectre facing the children of the 21st century.